The night Lucas Sterling walked into his own wedding rehearsal dinner 17 minutes late, smelling like expensive whiskey and another woman's perfume, nobody said a word. Not his mother. Not the guests. Not even his grandmother, who sat at the head of the table with a crystal glass of water in her hand and fury carved so deep into her face it looked permanent. Nobody said a word, except the woman sitting quietly at the far end of the table. She looked up from her phone, met his eyes across the room and said in a voice so calm it cut through every conversation in the hall, "You're late." 2 words. No anger. No embarrassment. No tears. "Please, I made a promise to my mom to get 1,000 subscription before Easter. Please help me make my dreams come true by hitting subscribe button, like and comment where you're watching from. Thank you." Lucas Sterling blinked. In 31 years of doing exactly whatever he wanted, no woman had ever looked at him like that. Like he was simply a problem she hadn't decided to solve yet. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her face. He didn't know anything about her except that his grandmother had arranged this meeting. But something about those 2 words sat in his chest the rest of that night like a splinter he couldn't reach. He should have paid more attention to that feeling. Because by the time he finally understood what it meant, Ava Reed had already saved his entire empire, and he hadn't even known she was doing it. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how a man like Lucas Sterling got tamed, you first have to understand exactly what kind of man he was. Lucas Sterling was not just rich. He was the kind of rich that makes regular wealthy people feel poor. At 31 he was the CEO of Sterling Group, a conglomerate with fingers in real estate, technology, private equity, and 3 other industries that average people only read about in financial magazines they didn't understand. His grandfather had built the company. His grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, had transformed it into an empire. And somewhere along the line, Lucas had inherited the keys to that empire without inheriting the discipline that built it. He was brilliant, everyone agreed on that. When Lucas actually showed up to work, his instincts were razor sharp. He could read a balance sheet the way some people read faces. He could walk into a negotiation and leave with everything he wanted before the other side realized what had happened. The problem was that Lucas Sterling almost never actually showed up to work. He showed up to parties. He showed up to charity galas where the cameras were rolling and the champagne was cold. He showed up to yacht trips in Monaco and ski weekends in Aspen. He showed up reliably and enthusiastically, wherever beautiful women and no responsibilities gathered. The tabloids loved him. The untamable billionaire. The Playboy. The man that boardrooms feared and mothers warned their daughters about. He framed the last headline. Hung it in his private office as a joke. His executive team did not think it was funny. Neither did the investors who had started quietly asking questions about leadership stability. And absolutely, certainly without any humor at all, neither did Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor Sterling was 74 years old and had survived 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, 1 near bankruptcy, and the death of her husband without losing a single percentage point of what she'd built. She was not a woman who lost things. She called Lucas into her office on a Tuesday morning in October. Not the Sterling Group boardroom. Not the executive suite. Her personal office. The one with the original architectural plans of the first Sterling building framed on the wall, and a mahogany desk that had seen more deals than most banks. Lucas walked in wearing sunglasses indoors and a 3-piece suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Eleanor didn't look up when he entered. She let him stand there for a full minute. Then she closed the folder in front of her, folded her hands, and looked at her grandson with the expression of a woman who had made a decision she was not going to negotiate. "Sit down, Lucas." He sat. "The board met last Thursday without you," she said. "I was in. I know where you were." Her voice had no edges. That was the terrifying part. No shouting. No drama. Just wait. You were in Ibiza with a woman whose name you won't remember in 6 months. While your CFO was fielding questions from 3 institutional investors who are reconsidering their positions because the CEO of Sterling Group has not attended a single earnings briefing in 4 months. Lucas opened his mouth. Eleanor continued. "Hargrove Capital is moving. You don't see it yet because you haven't been watching, but I have. They've been quietly acquiring shares through subsidiaries, and they intend to challenge your position before the next shareholders' meeting. If they convince even 2 more members of the board that you are not fit to lead, they can call a vote." The sunglasses came off. Lucas set them on the desk. For just a moment, the lazy charm dropped from his face and something sharper appeared underneath. How many shares do they have? Not enough. Yet. Eleanor picked up her water glass. But they're not wrong about you, Lucas. And that is the part that should bother you. Silence sat in the room like a third person. So what's the condition? He asked. Because with Eleanor there was always a condition. She looked at him for a long moment. Marriage. He laughed. It came out before he could stop it. A short, disbelieving sound. Eleanor did not smile. His laugh died. You want me to get married, he repeated as if saying it slowly would make it make more sense. I want you to grow up, she said. Marriage is simply the most visible evidence I can present to the board that you are capable of building something instead of just burning through everything you've been handed. You will get married within 60 days. You will conduct yourself with the discipline that this company requires. Or I will exercise my right as founder and primary shareholder to appoint an interim CEO while the board conducts a full leadership review. She paused. Do you understand what that means? Lucas understood exactly what it meant. It meant she would remove him. Publicly. In a way that Hargrove Capital and every other circling competitor would immediately weaponize. You wouldn't, he said. Lucas. Eleanor's voice was almost gentle. I built this company over 40 years. I love you. But I did not build it to watch you destroy it because you cannot be inconvenienced. He stared at his grandmother. The woman who had put him on her knee and taught him to count using stock prices. The woman who had watched him graduate top of his class and said simply, now the real work starts. The woman who had handed him the keys to the most powerful company in the city and said she believed in him. He believed her now. Fine, he said. The word tasted like defeat. Who? The name his grandmother gave him was Ava Reed. Lucas did what any powerful man with an ego the size of a continent did when he needed information. He had his assistant pull a background file within the hour. The file was thin. Disappointingly thin. Ava Reed, 28. Graduate degree in business from a mid-tier university. No notable family connections. No business profile. Her financial records were clean but modest, at least the ones that were accessible. She worked in some kind of consulting capacity, the details vague. No social media presence to speak of. No photos that told him anything beyond a quiet, composed face. His assistant had flagged a note at the bottom of the file. Subject's financial background contains several unusual privacy protections. Full records inaccessible through standard channels. Lucas had read that note and thought nothing of it. Privacy protections weren't unusual for people with paranoid accountants or minor family wealth they didn't want publicized. He should have thought about it a great deal more. Instead he looked at the thin file, at the modest profile, at the simple face in the photograph, and he thought, manageable. He thought, temporary. He thought, she won't be a problem. 3 of the worst miscalculations of his adult life, stacked in a row, and he made all 3 of them in about 90 seconds. They met for dinner 3 days before the wedding rehearsal. A restaurant Lucas owned a partial stake in, neutral enough territory he thought, while still allowing him to control the environment. Ava arrived before him. That was the first surprise. He'd been 5 minutes early, thinking he was being impressively punctual by his own standards. She was already seated, water glass in hand, reviewing something on her phone with the focused expression of someone who was actually working, not performing busyness. She looked up when he approached. No flutter. No wide eyes. No adjustment to her posture the way people sometimes adjusted when Lucas Sterling walked into a room and the atmosphere shifted. She just looked at him. Lucas Sterling, she said as if confirming something she'd already verified. Ava Reed, he replied, sliding into the chair across from her with the practiced ease of a man who always owned every room. The dinner was not what he expected. He'd prepared for shy. He'd prepared for nervous, for someone trying too hard to impress him, for the slightly desperate energy of someone who understood they were being evaluated and found wanting. He'd sat through 100 dinners with people who wanted something from him, and he knew exactly how those felt. Ava Reed did not want anything from him. Or if she did, she wore that want so far beneath the surface it was invisible. She asked him one question about the business that made him pause mid-sip of his water. One question about the Hargrove situation. Not by name but the shape of it, framed in a way that suggested she understood corporate dynamics with unusual precision. Where did you, he started. I read, she said simply and moved the conversation somewhere else. He drove home that night feeling something unfamiliar. Not attraction exactly. Not respect yet. Something more uncomfortable than either. Something that felt like the beginning of being seen. He pushed it down and told himself she was fine. Manageable. Temporary. The wedding was small by sterling standards, which meant it still cost more than a reasonable house and appeared in 6 different media outlets by the following morning. Ava wore a dress that was elegant without being loud. She smiled at the right moments and said the right words and held his hand at the altar with a steady grip that didn't shake once. Lucas caught himself watching her hands during the vows. Steady. So. The hands of someone who was not nervous. Why isn't she nervous? He pushed the question away. They signed the papers. They took the photos. Eleanor Sterling stood in the front row and watched her grandson become a married man with the expression of someone who had placed a very careful bet and was waiting to see if it would pay off. The honeymoon was a performance for the cameras. 4 days in a private villa in the Maldives that Lucas had used before for significantly less ceremonial purposes. He was professional about it. Separate rooms, shared meals, a public presence that looked exactly like what his grandmother had asked for. Ava was unbothered by the arrangement. She spent most of her time working on what exactly she was vague about. Consulting matters. Client calls. The kind of explanations that were technically answers without being information. On the 3rd night they sat on the villa terrace and the sky was doing something extraordinary with stars. And Lucas, feeling the particular recklessness that expensive whiskey and inconvenient thoughts sometimes produced, said, "You're not what I expected." Ava looked at him sideways. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier." She was quiet for a moment. Then, easier for who? He didn't have a good answer. She finished her drink, said goodnight and went inside. He sat on that terrace for another hour, turning the question over. Easier for who? Back in the city, Lucas attempted to return to his previous life as smoothly as possible. The attempt lasted 11 days. It ended the night he arrived home at 2 in the morning and found Ava in the kitchen, awake, laptop open, papers spread across the island in a pattern that looked chaotic but somehow wasn't. She was on a phone call, speaking in a low, precise voice, and when she looked up and saw him she didn't end the call. She held up one finger, one moment, like he was an interruption she'd anticipated and already scheduled around. He stood in his own kitchen and waited. She finished the call, closed the laptop, looked at him with that clear, measuring expression. "We have a dinner with your board members on Friday," she said. "Harrington and Cole. Your grandmother arranged it. You'll need to actually know the Q3 projections before you walk in there, because Cole will ask and you don't want to stumble." Lucas stared at her. "How do you know Cole will ask?" "Because Cole is thinking about pulling his discretionary vote, and when investors get nervous they ask about projections. It's not complicated." "And how do you know Cole is getting nervous?" Something moved across her face. A small thing. There and gone. "I told you. I read," she said, and she picked up her papers and walked out of the kitchen. But here is where the story splits in 2 directions at once. Because while Lucas was running one set of problems in the open, another problem was running underground and almost nobody could see it. Sterling Group had a rot in its walls. Not the kind of rot that shows on the outside. Not yet. The kind that lives deep inside the structure, eating quietly. 3 senior executives, Morrison, Tate, and a CFO named Brennan, had been in quiet communication with Hargrove Capital for nearly 5 months. Not selling outright. Worse than that. They were positioning. Feeding Hargrove information. Timing the release of bad news to maximize damage to the stock. Slowly, methodically weakening the company from inside while the CEO was too distracted by his own lifestyle to notice the floor buckling beneath him. They had a plan that was 18 months in the making and it was almost ready. What they had not planned for, what nobody had planned for, was Ava. She had known about the rot within the first 3 weeks of the marriage. Not because she was guessing. Because Ava Reed had not arrived at this marriage the way Lucas believed she had. She had not been quietly recommended by a grandmother's friend because she was gentle and manageable and unlikely to cause disruption. She had been watching Sterling Group for 14 months before the marriage was ever mentioned. Through channels Lucas didn't know existed, in ways his investigators hadn't found because they hadn't been looking in the right places. She had been watching because Sterling Group sat adjacent to 3 industries that intersected with her own work in ways that mattered, and because the rot she'd spotted from the outside had confirmed what she suspected. The marriage had been, in its own way, an opportunity she hadn't created but had chosen not to refuse. She didn't tell Lucas any of this. Not yet. She simply began to work. From inside the Sterling Group household, with the access that being the CEO's wife quietly afforded her, Ava started pulling on threads. She contacted sources she had never introduced to anyone. She moved pieces that weren't visible on any board Lucas or his team were watching. She had a meeting, documented as a spa appointment, with a securities attorney who owed her a very old favor. She had 2 phone calls with people whose names would have rearranged the face of every executive at Sterling Group if they'd heard them. And the whole time she made Lucas dinner twice a week, showed up at the social events she was supposed to show up at, and gave every board wife the impression that she was simply a quiet, pleasant woman who had stumbled into an impressive marriage. It was, professionally speaking, one of her better performances. The first crack in Lucas's arrogance happened on a Wednesday. He walked into the office to find Morrison in a closed-door meeting with 2 men Lucas didn't recognize. Men who had walked past security with visitor badges that, when Lucas later pulled the log, had credentials that were technically valid but traceable to a shell company he'd never heard of. He mentioned it to Ava that evening, not really expecting anything, mostly thinking out loud. She asked 3 questions. Specific questions, the kind that had too much direction in them for someone who was supposedly unconnected to this world. He looked at her over the dinner table. You already knew about this. She met his eyes. I heard you mention Morrison last week. I did some reading. Reading again. He let it go. But the splinter was back, and it was deeper this time. The Friday board dinner was a war conducted over white tablecloths and Michelin-starred food. Cole arrived looking like a man who had already made up his mind and was attending out of courtesy. Harrington was quieter, watchful in the way of someone who hadn't committed yet. 2 other board members, Patterson and Lyle, flanked them on either side, reading the room the way board members do when they sense a shift in power. Lucas had done his homework. He'd spent 2 days actually working, going through the Q3 projections with a thoroughness that surprised his own team, and he walked into that dinner more prepared than he'd been for anything in recent memory. But it was Ava who controlled the room. Not loudly. Not visibly. The way water controls the shape of a riverbank. Gradually, without anyone watching the individual moments. She asked Cole about his foundation's recent education initiative in a way that unlocked 20 minutes of conversation that made Cole feel heard and seen in the particular way that rich, powerful men rarely feel. She redirected Harrington's skepticism about Q4 projections with a question about market positioning that reframed the entire conversation before Harrington realized he was now arguing a different point. She said less than anyone at the table, and somehow the entire temperature of the dinner shifted in Sterling Group's favor by the time dessert arrived. Cole shook Lucas's hand at the end of the night and said he was looking forward to the next shareholders' meeting. In the car home, Lucas looked at his wife. You did that, he said. The Q3 numbers did that, she replied, looking out the window. Ava. She turned. Thank you, he said. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Just a fraction. There and gone like the thing that crossed her face in the kitchen. You did the work, she said, and looked back out the window. Then everything accelerated. Morrison made his move in November. A coordinated release of 3 pieces of negative financial information. A downgraded credit assessment from an analyst firm with quiet Hargrove connections. A supplier contract dispute that had been manufactured rather than naturally occurring, and a leaked internal memo that painted Lucas as unstable and the board as fractured. It hit the financial press on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning Sterling Group's stock had dropped 11%. The phones at Sterling Group Corporate erupted. Investors called. Media called. Board members called each other, which was the most dangerous call of all. Lucas sat at the head of the Situation Room at 7 in the morning, looking at his team, and for the first time in his adult life he felt the specific coldness of something he'd built, or inherited, genuinely slipping out of his hands. He looked stable. He kept his voice level. But under the table his right hand was pressed flat against his thigh, grounding himself. Someone internal fed this, he said. His team exchanged glances. They suspected. But suspicion without evidence is just noise. We need names, Lucas said. And we need them before the emergency board session on Thursday. He didn't get them from his own team. He got home that night to find Ava already asleep, or apparently asleep, and he sat in his office until 3 a.m. going through every document, every communication log, every financial movement he could access trying to find the thread. He found fragments, suggestions, shapes in the dark that he couldn't quite see clearly. The next morning, an anonymous encrypted file arrived in his secure email. No sender. No explanation. Just a clean, precise document laying out the trail, communications, financial transactions, dates, amounts, that connected Morrison, Tate, and Brennan to Hargrove Capital in a chain of evidence so airtight it would hold up in court. Lucas read it twice. Then he called his attorney. Then he sat very still and asked himself who could have assembled this. Because this wasn't a leak. This was an investigation. A professional, thorough, methodical investigation conducted by someone with access, resources, and connections that didn't exist anywhere in Sterling Group's org chart. He thought about Ava's precise questions. Her careful redirections. The closed laptop. The midnight phone calls. I read. He thought about the file his assistant had flagged. Privacy protections. Full records inaccessible through standard channels. He thought about the way she had walked into their marriage without a single question about his money, his lifestyle, his power. The way someone only walks into a wealthy marriage when they don't need anything from it. He sat with that thought for a very long time. Then his phone rang. His attorney telling him the evidence was solid. He used it. Morrison, Tate, and Brennan were confronted Thursday morning, before the emergency board session. By Thursday afternoon they had resigned. By Friday, the securities investigation had been quietly referred to the appropriate authorities with the full package of evidence. The Hargrove Capital play collapsed. Without inside access to Sterling Group's vulnerabilities, without the board destabilization their informants had been feeding, the acquisition attempt fell apart like a bridge without support beams. The stock recovered 6 of the 11% within 48 hours. The crisis was over. Lucas should have felt triumph. He'd moved fast, responded correctly, protected the company. His team thought he'd found the evidence himself and he hadn't corrected them. The board session on Thursday had been the best meeting of his tenure. Decisive, controlled, visionary in a way that his grandmother watched from the far end of the table with an expression that might almost have been pride. But he didn't feel triumph. He felt like a man standing in a room that he'd always thought was one size, and someone had just quietly removed a wall. And the room was in fact significantly, fundamentally larger than he'd known. And in the center of that larger room was his wife. He tried to ask her directly. Twice. Both times she gave him variations on the same non-answer. Quiet smiles. Redirections. The careful, practiced art of a person who was not ready to be known yet. He watched her more carefully after that. Not with suspicion. That had burned off quickly. Replaced by something that felt more like being outmaneuvered by a chess player who was 6 moves ahead and had been the entire time. He was always working. The phone calls he'd once barely noticed he now paid attention to. The shifts in register, the particular precision of her language on certain calls versus others. The way her posture changed slightly when she was operating in a different professional context. He was building a picture. It was still incomplete, but it was becoming a picture. And alongside the professional puzzle, something else was building. Something quieter, more inconvenient, more disruptive in a completely different way. He was falling for her. Not the superficial, too-weak falling that he'd experienced so many times it barely registered anymore. Something slower and more structural. The kind that builds in the places you're not looking. In the way she laughed at something actually funny rather than socially laughing. In the way she was direct with him in a way that wasn't cruelty but wasn't performance either. In the way she had never once tried to make him feel small. Even when she had every opportunity and every right. She had saved his company and never asked for credit. She had watched him be careless and never weaponized it against him. She had walked into a temporary arrangement and treated it with more integrity than he had treated most permanent things. He didn't know what to do with any of that. The major shareholders' meeting was scheduled for the first week of December. In the weeks leading up to it, something strange began happening in the market. A new investment firm, quiet, private, with a structure so clean and protected that financial journalists who tried to profile it kept hitting walls, began making strategic moves in areas adjacent to Sterling Group. Not threatening moves. Stabilizing ones. positioning that, if Lucas had seen it in isolation, he'd have described as brilliantly defensive. He brought it to his strategy team. Nobody could identify the firm's leadership. The registered name was Raven Capital. The leader was known in the limited circles that knew anything at all as Director Raven. "Find out who it is," Lucas told his head of intelligence. His head of intelligence called back 2 days later. "We can't," the man said in the voice of someone not used to saying those words. "Every trail dead ends. Legal structures in 4 jurisdictions, nominee directors holding layers. Whoever set this up didn't want to be found." Lucas hung up. He went home. Ava was at the kitchen island working. Always working in that quiet, self-contained way. Papers. 2 phones. The particular posture of someone managing multiple streams at once. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. She looked up. Their eyes held. "Ava," he said. "Lucas," she replied. "Who are you?" She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the question hung in the air between them and became something heavier than words. Then she said, "Your wife." And she looked back down at her papers. The December shareholders' meeting was the largest Sterling Group had convened in 4 years. The fall crisis had created a credibility gap that needed to be filled publicly, with confidence, with numbers, and with a clear statement of leadership stability. Every major stakeholder was present. The media was in the lobby. The board was arrayed along the conference table in the penthouse boardroom with the city sprawling 40 floors below the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lucas opened the meeting. And he was good, genuinely, undeniably good. Prepared in a way that turned heads. The Q3 deep dive, the Morrison situation addressed directly and with authority, the forward projections laid out with the kind of clarity that made numbers feel like certainty. The room shifted within the first 20 minutes. Cole, who'd been skeptical at the dinner, was leaning forward. Harrington's skepticism had quietly become attention. Lucas was 2/3 through the presentation when his assistant slipped him a note. "Director Raven of Raven Capital has arrived. Present in the lobby. Requests admittance as a shareholder." The room noticed his pause. It was half a second, barely visible, but the board noticed. "One moment," Lucas said, and he made a decision that later, in the aftermath, he'd recognize as the last decision he made while still believing he controlled the situation. "Please send them up." The boardroom door opened. 27 people in a glass-walled room on the 40th floor of a city skyscraper all turned toward the door. The woman who walked in wore charcoal gray. Her heels were quiet against the floor. Her posture was the posture of someone who had walked into rooms like this one many times and found them unremarkable. Lucas had his back to the door. He was mid-sentence. He heard Cole make a sound, not words, just a sound. Surprise or recognition or something between the two. He turned. The world went very still. Ava Reed, his wife, his quiet wife, his manageable wife, the woman he'd married as a temporary solution to an inconvenient problem, walked to the center of his boardroom and looked at him with the clear, composed expression he'd been trying to read for 3 months. And then Cole stood up. Not just Cole. Patterson. Harrington. Well, one by one the board members of Sterling Group rose from their seats. Not for Lucas. For her. "Director Raven," Cole said. "We weren't aware you were a stakeholder in Sterling Group." "I've maintained my position quietly," Ava said. Her voice was the same voice she used to ask him what he wanted for dinner. Steady. Clear. Without any performance at all. "Given recent events, I thought it was time to be more visible." The silence in that room was the loudest thing Lucas had ever heard. He looked at his wife. He looked at the board members standing for her. He looked at the folder his assistant was placing on the conference table in front of an empty chair. A chair that was being pulled out without instruction by his head of corporate affairs. For her. The man who had been called untamable by every tabloid in the country. The man who had walked into every room of his adult life owning the air in it. The man who had looked at a thin background file 3 months ago and thought manageable. Stood in his own boardroom and understood, with the particular clarity of total and absolute surprise, that he had never once been the most powerful person in the room. Not once. Not even close. Ava. Her name came out differently than he'd ever said it before. Or, like something he was learning to say correctly for the first time. She looked at him. "Raven Capital," he said. "The recovery. The supplier chain moves. The evidence." He stopped. The evidence on Morrison. That was you, he said. All of it. She said nothing. You saved it, he said. Without telling me. You wouldn't have accepted help from me, she said, and the truth of it hit him like cold water. You'd already decided what I was. You'd already decided I was simple, ordinary, unimportant. You needed to learn to look more carefully before I could tell you what I was looking at. 40 people were watching. The board. His executives. The media representatives who'd been allowed into the observation level. Cole cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling. Director Raven holds a 22% stake in Sterling Group through Raven Capital's holdings, which have been quietly accumulated over the past 14 months. She also holds controlling shares in 4 firms that serve as critical suppliers and strategic partners in your primary revenue streams. He paused. In practical terms, she has been one of the 2 most important stakeholders in your company for over a year. Lucas looked at his grandmother. Eleanor Sterling was sitting at the far end of the table, and the expression on her face was not surprise. You knew, he said. Eleanor picked up her water glass. I knew she was extraordinary, she said carefully. I didn't know the full scope. But I knew she was the right woman. She paused. I knew you needed someone who wouldn't be impressed by what you had, Lucas. Someone who had their own. The meeting continued. Of course it did. Rooms like this one don't stop for personal reckonings, and Lucas Sterling was nothing if not trained to function under pressure. He finished the presentation. He answered the questions. He moved through the motions of the 2-hour session with the surface competence his grandmother had always known he possessed. But the entire time, in the part of his mind that was running underneath the professional performance, he was doing the only honest accounting he'd done in years. He had walked into this marriage looking for a prop. A temporary arrangement. A box to check so he could go back to the life he'd been living. Instead, he had married a woman who had spent 3 months quietly ensuring he had a company left to go back to. Who had investigated the rot in his walls while he was sleeping. Who had attended every performative social engagement with perfect composure while running a private equity empire in her spare time. Who had looked at him, at his carelessness, his arrogance, his absolute confidence in his own centrality, and had decided that he was worth saving before he'd given her a single reason to think so. You were losing your company, Lucas. So you saved it. Yes. He thought about the steady hands at the altar. The 2 words at the rehearsal dinner. The kitchen at midnight. I read. The dinner with Cole. The question she'd asked him the first night. Easier for who? He thought about the way he'd felt that first night, like a splinter he couldn't reach. He thought she had been right about him from the beginning. Had known exactly who he was and had chosen, for reasons that were still not entirely clear to him, to invest in the possibility of who he could become. After the meeting, the room cleared slowly. The executives filtered out. The board members lingered, most of them finding reasons to speak to Ava, to confirm the relationship, to recalibrate their understanding of the Sterling Group power structure. Lucas watched them. Watched the way the room oriented itself differently now. Not toward him as the singular axis of authority, but toward them both, and sometimes toward her specifically. He was not threatened by it. That surprised him. He had expected to feel something territorial, some bruised thing that needed soothing. Instead, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was 22 years old and had just closed his first solo deal and called his grandmother to tell her, and she'd said, "Now let's see what you do next." He felt like someone at the beginning of something that actually mattered. The room was almost empty when he crossed it. She was standing at the far window, the one that faced north toward the part of the city where Sterling Group had its earliest buildings. He stopped a few feet away. "I owe you an apology," he said. She turned. The composure was still there, but there was something else underneath it now. Something that might have been waiting. "For which part?" she asked. "For looking at you and seeing what I needed you to be instead of what you are." He paused. "For assuming. For not looking more carefully." She was quiet. For needing to be saved and not being grateful enough to even know it was happening. He stopped again. The next part was harder. He wasn't practiced at this. At the particular kind of honesty that requires surrendering the armor. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever been in a room with. And I wasted 3 months not seeing that because I was too arrogant to look." Ava Reed looked at her husband for a long moment. Then she said, "You looked at Cole's projections for 2 days." "What?" "Before the dinner. You actually went through them. Something in her expression was almost a smile, held just back from it. That was the first time you'd done that. Done real work instead of relying on instinct and charm. She paused. I noticed. He was quiet. You're not the man I thought I was marrying, she said. I thought I was marrying someone who was going to be a useful arrangement. And you turned out to be something else. She looked at him steadily. You turned out to be someone trying to become something better. You just needed to be challenged enough to do it. He took a step closer. So what do we do now? The question was larger than it sounded. Both of them heard the full weight of it. She looked at him, at her husband, at the man who had arrived 17 minutes late to his own rehearsal dinner and somehow, somewhere in the months between that night and this one, had become someone worth looking at directly. Now, she said, we build something together. Pause. If that's what you want. Ava. I need you to be sure, Lucas. The composure was still there, but he could hear the difference now, the thing underneath it that she kept controlled. Not because you're grateful. Not because you're impressed. Because this, she touched the air between them briefly, is a different thing than an arrangement. And I need to know you understand that. He understood it. He also understood, standing in the emptying boardroom with the city spread outside the glass, that the answer to her question was the most consequential thing he had ever decided in his life. More than any deal. Any acquisition. Any decision that had ever been made in this room. He opened his mouth. And in the lobby 40 floors below, his assistant was signing for a registered letter addressed to Lucas Sterling, Co. Sterling Group. A letter bearing the official seal of a federal securities commission he'd never heard of, referencing Raven Capital, referencing transactions that predated the marriage by 2 years, referencing questions that no one had yet asked Ava Reed out loud. Questions that, when they were asked, were going to change everything again. The letter sat in the lobby. The elevator hadn't been called yet. And upstairs, Lucas Sterling stood at the window and looked at his wife and began to answer a question whose full implications neither of them yet understood. To be continued.